Putin's war in Ukraine was largely driven by his personal ambitions and vision of world order. However, it's inaccurate to say the war was inevitable. In fact, Putin spent years consolidating power and eliminating rivals, which ultimately enabled him to launch such a large-scale conflict. This raises the question, could Putin have been stopped on his path to war, and at what points during his rule could this have been achieved? As many recall, Putin's rise to power was largely orchestrated by Russian elites who decided to install him as Yeltsin's replacement and actively supported him through the media. Although other candidates like Nemtsov were considered, they chose Putin, a faceless bureaucrat seemingly without ambition. The Russian elites thought Putin would be fully controllable. His ascent to power was essentially decided by a small circle of individuals close to Yeltsin. Putin's first term was challenging for him as well. Power wasn't yet concentrated in his hands, but processes of centralization and dismantling existing institutions were already underway. The Yeltsin-era oligarchs soon realized Putin's true nature, and a power struggle began. The Yukos affair became the centerpiece of this struggle. The state went after Khodorkovsky and several of his associates, accusing them of tax evasion and oil industry fraud. While such practices were common during the oligarch-dominated 1990s, this case symbolized the battle between old and new elites, with the latter emerging victorious. Thus, the Yeltsin-era oligarchs were defeated. Some, like Berezovsky, fled. Others, like Khodorkovsky, were imprisoned, and some, like Friedman, submitted to new roles as controlled oligarchs. This period presented a prime opportunity for Putin to consolidate his power, with the elimination of the oligarchic clan being the first step towards authoritarianism. The next significant event was the Putin-Medvedev castling in 2008. Due to constitutional term limits, which they were reluctant to violate at the time, Putin essentially handed power to Medvedev, his closest ally, while assuming the role of prime minister. Opinions vary on the true nature of the Putin-Medvedev relationship and who actually ran the country during this time. However, some political analysts believe Medvedev had at least partial political agency, and Putin's return in 2012 wasn't a foregone conclusion. Contemporaries thought Medvedev's rule might extend to 2 terms, giving him more opportunities to strengthen his power and create an autonomous team. However, at the end of his term, power was returned to Putin, ending speculation about Medvedev as an alternative. Theoretically, an elite coup was possible at that time. Putin's power wasn't all-encompassing, and the new president, Medvedev, was viewed favorably by elites, ordinary citizens, and Western countries alike. He was considered liberal and open-minded, which seemed true at the time. During this period, another crucial event occurred, the war in Georgia. It began just months after Medvedev took office. The troubled regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia flared up again, and Russian troops ultimately invaded Georgia and conducted a military campaign. The war ended in a matter of days. The West's reaction at the time was relatively muted. Apart from public condemnations, Russia faced no real consequences. There was no talk of sanctions, and the conflict resolution was mediated by European countries. If NATO countries had responded more forcefully, it could have altered Russia's foreign policy for years to come. However, Russia's invasion of Georgia was largely ignored, setting a dangerous precedent. Russia could directly intervene in its neighbors' affairs, as later happened in 2014 and 2022. The end of Medvedev's term was tumultuous, marked by crisis after crisis. After the parliamentary elections, mass protests erupted across Russia in 2011. The catalyst was the alleged rigging of elections in favor of United Russia, Putin, and Medvedev's party of power. The Bolotnaya Square protests became one of the largest in modern Russian history, with tens to hundreds of thousands taking to the streets throughout the year. Participants ranged from far-left radicals to Russian nationalists. There was even an attempt to consolidate forces and create an alternative government. The goal was to change the current regime and restore democracy in Russia. However, the protests ultimately failed. Various factors contributed to this failure, from the opposition's inability to form a united front to some opposition leaders striking deals with the government. Many consider this the last real chance for change within Russia and for a return to democracy, as Putin's power began to increase dramatically from 2012 onward. 2014 marked the year of Russian military interventions in Ukraine, with the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. During Ukraine's political crisis, Russia seized the opportunity to deploy troops to Crimea and soon annexed the territory. Similar events unfolded in other regions, leading to the war in Donbass and a series of clashes in southeastern Ukraine. Regarding the international community's response, while it was stronger than during the Georgian scenario, it was still considered weak and insufficient, a fact Western politicians have recently begun to acknowledge openly. The main tool used to pressure Russia was sanctions. While it can't be said that the sanctions were ineffective, they did hurt Russia. They didn't deliver a crushing blow. At that time, there were many more options to pressure Russia than there are now, and the Russian government wasn't prepared for such a turn of events. However, the response proved insufficient, and the benefits of seizing territories outweighed the costs. These benefits were largely electoral rather than material. After the annexation of Crimea, Putin, who had been losing popularity, gained new momentum, with his approval ratings surpassing those from the beginning of his rule. Russians largely approved of these actions. In recent years, there have been many events, with a course set for complete control over the power apparatus and a transition to a new level of authoritarianism. Whether anything could have been changed is questionable, but certain precedents could have become the basis for mass discontent or elite dissatisfaction. This includes the constitutional coup in 2020, when Putin managed to reset his term limits to run for re-election this year. The Russian population reacted rather weakly to this, and COVID-19 restrictions played into Putin's hands. At the end of the same year, Navalny was poisoned, and at the beginning of 2021, he was imprisoned. Navalny's return didn't have the desired effect. Support wasn't as significant as expected, and he was simply sentenced to a lengthy prison term. He died in prison by the end of this year. The outbreak of war in 2022 shocked the world, although Western intelligence had warned about it. This event became the culmination of Putin's rule, and the war continues to this day. Could Putin have been stopped on the eve of the war? Probably not. The one thing Western countries could have done was to strengthen Ukraine with their own weapons before the war, which would have given Ukraine an even greater advantage on the battlefield. However, this wasn't done, perhaps due to the failure in Afghanistan. With the start of the war, Western countries didn't dare to close the skies over Ukraine, fearing a direct confrontation with Russia, although theoretically, they could have done so. The effect of sanctions again proved less impactful than expected. Moreover, while sanctions were initially meant to be harsher, they often became softer and more compromising by the time they were implemented. Recently, there's been talk of deploying Western troops to Ukraine, but countries are again wary of crossing red lines. At the same time, the introduction of Western troops could potentially halt Putin's advance, at least in the areas where these troops would be stationed. Many anticipated internal instability in Russia with the onset of war, whether through a coup, revolution, or civil uprising. Throughout this period, there were only two notable episodes. First, the protests at the beginning of the war, which proved insufficiently strong and serious. Second, Prigozhin's rebellion, which ended as abruptly as it began. In conclusion, it's worth noting that Putin encountered various crisis moments along his path where his power could have ended. These ranged from the oligarchs in the 2000s to serious international pressure in the 2010s. However, everything ultimately turned in his favor, resulting in such a long reign and all the costs associated with it.